Good evening. If I may, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to not only welcome you, but to also give you a little bit of a context for the event tonight, but really for the exhibition, before I ask Michael Hayes to come and introduce the speakers and lead the discussion and the presentations. I think it's a special honor and a special moment for us to be able to host this exhibition. I think that for the last maybe 10 or more years, maybe other people will correct me. I think there's been a great deal of movement in contemporary Chinese architecture, what's been happening in many different cities. And it's been really exciting to witness the radical transformation that's been taking place over a relatively short period of time. And the ever-increasing importance of architecture, but also of the quality of the work. This, of course, is in part perhaps due to the way in which the schools of architecture in China have systematically improved. It's because of the way that there is so much interest and enthusiasm in the fields of architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, and so on. I suspect it has partly to do with the incredible commitment of young Chinese architects to study abroad, to be engaged with contemporary practice outside of China. There are many, many factors, but what is undeniable that is the fact that something is happening and something interesting is happening. And maybe in Asia 10 years ago, it was really mainly Japan that was the center of creative design activity in many respects, maybe followed by Korea, and the kind of relationship between what happened in Japan and what happened in Korea is also a kind of interesting, thematic issue to explore. But I think, suddenly one really sees that there are a number of really important, very exciting, emerging Chinese architects, which is something that is very important to witness. And this is, I feel, a very good reason for the GSD to host an exhibition at this particular moment, because it's not like everything has happened, it's all clear, the lines of connection and affiliations have been well established. It's just that there is a sense of emergence, that things are happening, and that there is, in fact, an increasing number of important buildings and design projects that are happening across the country. A few years ago, we had a series of lectures and debates and discussions linked to what was happening in Japan, or what's been happening in Japan under the rubric of New Innocence. And I think more recently, there's been an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art that has pursued some of the connections and some of the people that we actually brought here. And I feel very confident that in a very short period of time, we will also be witnessing the work of this generation of Chinese architects in many institutions in the States, in Europe, and we will see more and more exhibitions and publications devoted to the recognition and discussion of their work. One other thing I want to say is that despite the interest in design and architecture, there is actually still very much a paucity in terms of the number of people who are actually involved in the discussion and debates about architecture in China. So China, at the risk of sounding incorrect, maybe has a lot of very interesting emerging architects, but it has very few architectural critics and theorists who really debate, understand, and engage in the conversations with the contemporary generation of architects. So we're very lucky to have Li Xiangning as a friend of the school, someone that I've had the privilege of collaborating with in China, but also he was invited last year by the Department of Architecture to teach a course on contemporary architecture in China, and subsequently we've also asked him whether he would agree to be the curator of this exhibition on contemporary architecture, and we're really grateful to him and to all the architects. Many of them are here, and maybe I can ask you, please sort of stand up and be recognized. We have Jupe from Pei Zhu Studio who's here, Zhu Xiaofeng from Scenic Architecture Office, Wang Shenfei from HHD Fan, Louis Chen of Studio Link Art, and Wang Yan of GOA Architects. And these architects will actually participate in a discussion with Li Xiangning tomorrow at 12 o'clock in Stubbins. We will also be later on joined by Professor Wu Jiang, who's the vice president and professor at Tongji University, and again, a friend of the school, someone who spent time here. In fact, we've been very lucky to really have had such good relationship with so many schools, from Tongji to Tsinghua to Beida, Southeast, many of the really great universities in China. So we're really very happy about that. We're also very grateful to our friends from Soil, Florian Eidenberg and Jing Liu, who have done such a remarkable job with the exhibition. And I'll leave it to Michael to recognize many of the other people who've been part and parcel of this project that Michael is going to thank. So once again, really thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to Li Xiangning for doing such a wonderful job. And thank in advance to Michael Hayes for agreeing to be the master of ceremonies tonight and get the ball rolling. Please welcome Michael Hayes.
Thanks, Mohsen. Indeed, it's a lot of uncharted territory, which makes it very exciting. I actually am very excited about this exhibition, about having these people here. Xiangning has become a good friend, and it's been very generous. I wanted to mention, just following a few things. First, to thank Dan Borelli and his team, who constructed and installed the exhibition. It's actually an amazing thing, Dan, and thank you very, very much. And also to thank Melanie Park, who translated and edited some of the text. Editing sometimes is a form of translation, right, in this case. So Melanie is a PhD student in our program here. But I was thinking, Mohsen was talking about how quickly things changed around in the architecture scene in China, and personal experience in this school kind of adds to that. I just want to mention that Xiaofeng Zhu, who is one of the participants and who's here tonight, he and Zhang Ke, who is also in the exhibition and is teaching here this semester, were two of the very first Chinese students to graduate from the GSD in the architecture program. The one other Xiaofeng that I think I remember was Ping Wang. And the three first students to graduate from China from the GSD. And look around and look how many graduate now. The emergence of China onto the architecture scene, as felt by this school, is explosive. I mean, it's not that long ago. And the exhibition, I hope, captures some of that importance and emergence. As Mohsen mentioned, Jing Liu is the exhibition designer. She will join us at the table shortly. She received her education in China, Japan, the UK, and the United States, concluding with a Master of Architecture from Tulane. In 2008, Jing, together with Florian Eidenberg, can I say our own Florian Eidenberg, founded SOIL, and the firm quickly won the Museum of Modern Art PS1 Young Architects program. That was 2010. They went on to design the award-winning Kukje Gallery in Seoul, and then in spring 2013, SOIL won the competition to design the Schremm Museum of Art at the University of California, Davis, which is an extraordinary jump, and it's, again, explosive, if you will. Jing has taught at Columbia, at Syracuse, at Parsons School of Design. We'll hear from her shortly. I want to go ahead and introduce the two respondents tonight. Antoine Picon, of course, here needs not much of an introduction, but to the visitors, Antoine is the Ware Travelstead Professor in the History of Architecture and Technology here at the GSD and Director of our research program at the GSD. He teaches courses, of course, in the history and theory of architecture and technology. He's also the chairman of the Fondation Le Corbusier in Paris. Jupe, whom Antoine has already mentioned, will also respond after Antoine. He received a Master of Architecture from Tsinghua and then again at another at UC Berkeley. And he founded the studio Pei Zhu in Beijing in 2005. He was awarded one of the 5 greatest architects under 50 in 2011, and he's won several international awards. His work has been exhibited in important venues all across the world, including the Venice Biennale and including the Centre Pompidou. In 2006, he was commissioned by the Guggenheim Foundation to design the Guggenheim Art Pavilion in Abu Dhabi, and then in 2007, the Guggenheim Museum in Beijing. Many other built works, but that will do, I would say. And then Xiangning Li, as I said, he's the curator of the exhibition. I know Xiangning first as an alum from the MIT PhD program, which I also an alum of, where he too studied with Stanford Anderson. And that was our kind of first bonding, I think. But he taught here last spring. Very generous, very important presence in the school. He's deputy dean and professor of history and theory and criticism at Tongji University. He's a member of the International Committee on Architecture Critics, as Mosen said, one of the few critics in China. And he's published widely on contemporary Chinese architecture and urbanism in international magazines, Architecture Review, A+U, Architectural Record, Domus, Volume, and others. He's lectured before he came to the GSD. He'd lectured and taught at MIT, Princeton, USC, and other schools. And recent books, including a study of The Real and the Imagined, it's a study of urban theory in 2009, Updating China, that was 2010, and Total China, just coming in 2015. So the way it will go tonight, that Xiangning, I'll ask to the podium now to say a few things about the exhibition. Antoine will then respond, make the first response. Then I'll ask all the participants to come to the table, where we'll have a round table, and then eventually take comments and questions from the audience. Xiangning, welcome.
Thanks to Michael Mosen and Yaki Apolos and all the professors who invited me to teach in GSD the last spring. I think it's a wonderful experience for me. And I'm also very delighted to be invited to curate this exhibition with the title Critical Pragmatism. But tonight I'll give a brief presentation. The title is slightly different. It's called From Experimental Architecture to Critical Pragmatism, because I think I want to also mention the term experimental architecture in China, because it formed kind of a background and context for why I use the term critical pragmatism. So since the establishment of the new China in 1949, the key player of Chinese architectural practices has always been the state-owned medium, large design institutes. Privately operated architecture firms began to emerge in the 1980s, and arguably, they started to draw public attention as practices independent of state ownership, since Yung Ho Chang founded the Atelier Feichang Jianzhu in 1993. The discussion about experimental architecture among architecture journals is the effective attention paid to the practice of the then budding individual architects and an experimental paradigm, different from that of the mainstream state-owned architecture institutes emerged from the practices of these rising star architects in China. Different from the experimental architecture practice in the 1990s, today there are also a large number of younger individual architects with more diversified kind of patterns of practice without an evident common guiding principle of revolutionary commitment. They instead work for the government, private developers, small private owners, and other different sorts of clients. And more flexible and adaptive strategies have been evolved. Critical pragmatism, for me, may be a appropriate term to describe the kind of collective practice of contemporary Chinese individual architects of the new millennium. Experimental architecture as, first I want to say something about experimental architecture as resistance. As a matter of fact, the so-called experimental architecture and experimental architects are closely bounded up to the specific social economy and the cultural background of China in the late 1980s and early 1990s. At that time, a new trend was surging, no matter in the contemporary art and architecture, in desire of breaking through the tradition and communicating with the world. Developments of the contemporary art and introduction and translation of foreign architectural theories set the stage for Chinese experimental architecture. Yung Ho Chang, Ma Qingyun, Wang Shu, Liu Jiakun, and Tang Hua were definitely the leading figures of Chinese experimental architects at that time. Apart from architects and their works, there are also a series of architectural events, exhibitions, forums, etc., evolved around Chinese experimental architecture. Although it might be difficult to clearly define what's experimental architecture in China, but a rough list of related keywords will help understand that kind of concept. Young architect, individual practice, privately operated architecture firms, avant-garde, marginality, contemporaneity, Chineseness, etc. Some of these words indicate the age of the architects. Some instead express a kind of strong questioning attitude and challenge gesture towards orthodox of mainstream architecture trends and ideas from the very beginning. So since the 1980s, the Chinese architects have broken the limit set by the pure architecture tradition and attempts to draw and extract the internal essence of the Eastern architecture from our classical art and culture. They are not content with the extraction of traditional cultural details anymore, but try to establish a kind of new evaluation system under the condition of culture exchange at the present times, to seek and interpret Oriental culture that can counterweight the Western culture. So some scholars point out more clearly that the new architects mainly refers to Wang Shu, Liu Jiakun, and Yung Ho Chang, apt to be right-leaning, conservative, personal, narrowly narrative, emphasizing autonomous issues of architecture itself, tectonics, light and personal aesthetic experience, but the architecture before 1976 are almost completely opposite, left-leaning, politically radical, collective, broadly narrative, irrespective of architecture itself. Well, I myself would rather use the term resistance or refusal to describe the attitudes of the independent architects to use architecture as a vehicle to challenge the Western and Chinese mainstream architectural discourse and ideology, with or without consciousness in their pursuit of a so-called avant-gardism. Then I come to the word diversified architectural practice and critical pragmatism. Today's China has witnessed these architects establishing their own tribes and clusters in several important cities. These individual architects meet and communicate in various publications, exhibitions, collective design activities, and seminars, revealing different subpopulation characteristics of different cities. In addition, they participate in the architectural education of China, well-known architectural schools in small groups with a focus on architectural practice. These architects also develop their career in multi-dimensions, including exhibition, writing, teaching, academic research, and cultural communication. Such a state is quite different from that of the Western architects and also their predecessors, predecessors, Chinese architects, and even those of the contemporary state-owned design institutes. So confronting the kind of complex social and cultural environment and featuring different living conditions and practice strategies, they are seeking their personal positions in such an intricate relation network of different poles, such as architectural autonomy vs social reality, globalization vs localization, politics vs form. Firstly, they are confronted with the relation between architectural autonomy and the reality. So the so-called post-critical architecture theory produced in the States, developed in the last decades, advocate a kind of reflective architectural practice which can reflect the reality. Rather than a mere avant-garde resistance of simple refusal, it identifies an approach of compromising with the capital and also the social reality. Representatives of such theory, Sarah Whiting and Bob Sommer, have participated more than once in Chinese architecture symposiums and discussions in the so-called critical, post-critical debate featured issues by the magazine Time Plus Architecture, published by Tongji, exerting impact on Chinese architecture practice and theory. For Chinese architects, the chances to build their designs will bring them the greatest benefit for living in the world's biggest building factory, and also win them more attention on the international stage. Architecture has always been struggling between the autonomy and also the reliance on the capital and politics. The contemporary architecture discipline is unable to ignore the social economy and political culture to realize its pure autonomy. Therefore, the majority of current individual architects now face up to the reality and try to be pragmatic to achieve but at the same time to achieve a kind of critical position through cooperation with reality and to make the most of it. Diversity in clients type, such as the government, real estate developer, culture institutes, and individual landowners, and constant variability in project nature and scale may explain why few architects maintain a complete and persistent architectural language. I think Wanshu has one, but not for the rest of most of the architects. But constantly change strategies. They will change strategies according to the nature of the projects. After all, there are few architects that enjoy the right to pick the clients as Wanshu always does. It might also be reflected by the critical realism that to survive and try to develop in the market, some individual architecture firms would resort to some short-term expedient commercial design and mass residential design projects with quick returns to support the production of more interesting public culture buildings that are also more time and energy consuming. So they are clearly aware of the difference between the two types of design. So those kind of cash dispenser projects would never be shown in neither publications nor exhibitions. So such survival rules, more or less coming out of the passive choice, might have constructed the reality that many contemporary architects have to be confronted with in China. Secondly, they are also confronted with the relation between globalization and localization. Thanks to the international experience and vision brought by the overseas architectural education, many contemporary Chinese young architects are sensitive enough to take the initiative to think over the position of architecture practice in the binary opposition of globalization vs localization, as well as how to interpret issues of Chineseness in a contemporary manner. to respond to the local conditions with global modern form may be a result of negotiation and a makeshift, but it has presented the kind of balance between the architect's design ideal and the complicated social reality. Among Chinese individual architects, we can find those who act as deans and heads of architecture schools in the world, with their overseas education background and architecture practice at home at the same time, such as Yong Ho Zhang and Ma Qingyun. And those who win international building projects by constant participation in international architecture competitions, like Ma Yansong, and those who are educated in China but internationally accredited through persistent exploration of Chinese contemporary architectural identity, like Wang Shu. The dual practice formulated by real construction in China and exposure in the international architecture exhibitions and professional media publications enable each individual architect to find his own position in between two places of globalization and localization. Finally, they have to achieve the balance between politics and form. Form, as a matter of fact, is an important part of the core of architecture discipline. No matter how an architect claims his works are divorced from formalism, form has taken root in his architecture. The larger system of contemporary Chinese architecture has developed the competition evaluation criteria based on judgment of form in most competitions. Whatever approaches the evaluation takes, what to be resolved in the end is a proposition of form. The trajectory of contemporary Chinese politics has inevitably influenced on architecture form, of course. City policymakers with obscure political desire and aesthetic taste may eventually decide the formal criteria of architecture and urban design. However, politics can also have positive influence on architecture and urban design given proper guidance. The Qingpu Jiading, the two districts in Shanghai, effects is a kind of exemplary case. Dr. Sun Jiwei, the city mayor of the district government, meticulously selected from a name list of best contemporary individual Chinese architects to design projects in his district. Some young and talented individual architects seized opportunities and started their career here. These two suburb districts of Shanghai serve as a kind of experimental field for young architects to make a figure and gradually step onto the contemporary Chinese architecture stage, such as Liu Yichun, Zhu Xiaofeng here, among many others. Some of their early architecture works were also executed here, and at the same time, these works take on certain special features because of the provincial characteristics of the two districts, famous for their beautiful traditional water towns in Qingpu and Jiading. As Dr. Sun takes his post in Xuhui district and Pudong district, a group of high-quality buildings will be erected there, designed by leading contemporary architects invited by him. The recently built Long Museum, designed by Liu Yichun, is one of the exemplary buildings with very high overall construction quality that deserves the sensational design deliberation of the architects. So through the show, in the sixth, I selected 60 projects. I hope that through those 60 projects selected and shown in this exhibition, I hope the complicated culture and social situation in China could be seen, and also the works in the 5 categories, namely culture, residential, rural, digital architecture, and also urban regeneration, will throw some lights on the major fields where good architecture cases are emerging today in China. To conclude, nowadays, the external environment for Chinese architects have been greatly improved than 10 years ago. So young architects are even able to complete large-scale buildings with high construction quality. So at the same time, the main challenge to them is how to choose among oceans of styles, to find their own unique positions, and to keep the continuity of their formal identity and design strategy. So in order to make their building build up, they have to be practical and pragmatic. But at the same time, in order to design high quality buildings, they also need to keep to a kind of a criticality and try to be critical to the mainstream architecture practice. Although the individual architects have contributed to a large number of good quality works over decades, they have not responded, I think, the problem forcibly to the distinctive characteristics of the contemporary Chinese urbanism, such as bigness, swiftness, cheapness, uncertainty, and so on. Therefore, as we rejoice for the good buildings springing up under the Chinese individual architects' efforts, we have to be aware that the improvement of design and construction quality also relies on the independent critical consciousness, reflecting the ethos of ours, paying more attention to social connotation of architecture, and exploring the latent influence of new technology innovation might be the impetus for the Chinese individual architects to step further with great expectations. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks for Li Xiangning for putting together this wonderful exhibition that gives us to look at a different sort of Chinese architectural production than the one that was popularized by Rem Koolhaas at the turn of the 2000s. I'll be very brief. I think response should be brief. I would like actually to start by the title given to this exhibition and try to elaborate on it following Xiangning Li's eloquent presentation. There are really two words, critical and pragmatism, which are not often associated for sure, and there is definitely something a bit provocative in their juxtaposition. Critical of what? I'm generally struck by the ambiguity of the term, and I'm not certain that Kenneth Frampton did us a favor with his notion of critical regionalism. It has triggered since a number of difficult questions that we're not always able to solve. For example, can architecture truly be critical? Literature can be critical, but architecture needs to be built, and it cannot totally refuse its surrounding, and Xiangning Li did mention that. Critical of what, and above all, how? I think in the Chinese case, of course, there is probably something clearer insofar that, the projects shown are implicitly or explicitly critical of dominant condition of production in a country that has to build so many massive new cities every year. What I find striking in the exhibition projects are the scale of the interventions, the level of sophistication. The projects shown display clearly a critical distance from the mass production of housing and building. But this distance is not the distance of utopia or a proposition for a totally different world. There is an implicit acceptance of the condition as they are, hence the pragmatism, I suppose. Pragmatism also in a philosophical sense, since there seems to be no assumption made that is not strictly necessary to fulfill the brief imparted to the architect. So this translates, and if I had time, I was really struck by a number of questions, like, for example, how is form envisaged? You mentioned form a couple of times, but I think the way form is mobilized and understood seems to be very often original. The question of materials also really struck me a lot in many of the projects. Question of proportions and relation to the body, relation to cities and landscape. Now I would like to introduce another dimension, because the critical may probably translate in terms of time. We all know that it takes time to design with a certain degree of complexity. And for me, the critical character may have to do with time. How to slow down somewhat the production of architecture. We all know that with digital tools, we can produce more and more quickly. But I think part of the problem raised in this exhibition is how to revert from this acceleration that Rem Koolhaas, again him, advocated some 20 years ago. I think it has become a major question in the digital age, is how to slow down architecture and architectural design. And this is actually a question I'd like to know regarding many of these projects. How do they fit? How do they insert themselves in temporality? Speaking of time, what is also striking is the question of which cultural moment the projects refer themselves to. Some projects try, for instance, to reconnect in a way or another with Chinese traditional architecture while not falling into pastiche, while others look towards the modernist legacy. Others are clearly meant as responses to the digital, and there are even some parametric design that Schumacher would definitely enjoy. So tradition, modernism, contemporary, the production shown in the exhibition is definitely eclectic in its historical and stylistic references. There may be something critical in today's eclecticism. There is definitely something deeply pragmatic in it. Now the question may still be how to go beyond pragmatism as we know it. How can we reconstruct the possibility of a truly different future? Of course, in the case of China, what is shown is substantially different from what is usually built. But beyond some specifically Chinese references in some project, beyond the use of details, there may be the risk to join a kind of international architectural condition consisting in proposing a relatively soft alternative to the present. So what about the radically new? How can we restore the prerogative of the critical to break from the existing? Because criticality is supposed to be a break at some point. So this raises actually the question of pragmatism. A different kind of pragmatism is perhaps needed. And I think the Chinese situation may provide us some clues. For example, I'm always struck by the fact that China has proposed an original new way of thinking of the relation between state and private enterprise, which has become throughout the West a nagging question. How do we make state and private function, especially in architectural and urban question? So, and this is perhaps why we need China. We need China to help us to contribute to reinvent pragmatism. I think the definition of pragmatism is that it's never given. It must be constantly reinvented. And I've understood this exhibition as a first step in this direction of reinventing pragmatism. Thank you.
So in just a minute, I'm going to ask Jing Liu to talk a little bit about the exhibition, but let me just follow Xiangning a little bit with a question about the exhibition. 60 projects. The decision to make, most of them are represented in model as well as drawings, but everyone has a model, I think. And to treat them individually as distinct from, say, having photographs of context or thinking of the kind of heterogeneity of the assemblage in the city. These are very preliminary decisions you made. Could you speak about that? And then, just in a very, even in an anecdotal way, when you get to architects like Jupe or like Wang Xu, architects with a lot of built work, and I'm thinking of Antoine's mention of scale, the importance of scale. How do you choose from? So, I mean, some of the projects are obvious. The young architects maybe only have one or two projects, but other architects have many projects. How do you make the decision which one of those to choose?
Well, I think at the very beginning, I was asked to do a survey exhibition. So because in the States, then some people know Chinese architects and their works, but not many of them know who are the architects and what their projects are like. So the initiatives try to give a kind of a panorama of what China is doing right now. So that's why we have to pack so many projects into a very limited space. I think if we put a selected smaller numbers of projects and try to give more information and try to in some way show the behind the images and models, the actually production procedure, and also the way that people are using it, and also the interaction between architects and the local clients and also the users might be a better way to show it. But because at the very first step, I think it's good to give some lights on what China, what's really happening in China to the general audience. But we are looking at maybe at a larger scale exhibition at MoMA in the future, something like that. So the selection of the best projects, I think lies in the way that we try to show that there are 4 or 5 different fields. Like now there are emerging architects are working in the villages. Like this is a new trend, and also a lot of concern has been paid to regeneration and preservation and conservation of the old buildings. These are, and parametric is of course is another trend that some young architects are picking up, that method, like Wang Zhenfei, who's doing a lot of kind of digital architecture. So I think these are the 5 categories we set up first, agreed upon the 5 categories, and then we look at what's the most representative projects in those each individual category. This is the way that we selected the projects. And we also try to select from each architect, maybe like a Jupe and people like Wang Zhu, they have many projects that we want to show their recent projects, but at the same time representative, like the most representative of their current concern in their architectural practices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention one thing that Dan Borelli told me and confirmed this, that many of the models that were made for this show, many of the models that are shown in the show were made for this show. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think because according to Jing's design, she set up a kind of a fixed size of each model, so everybody has to. she's very powerful, I have to say. Well, people are surprised to see that so many models could be made, for this show in such a short period of time. Yeah.
Only in China.
Same size.
Only 2 or 3 years, months. Yeah.
Jing Liu, it's an extraordinary exhibition, and the mirrors, I think just went up a couple of days ago, and the mirrors changed everything. Yeah. Could you say a little bit about the original contact, also even how you and Xiangning, how the original contact happened, how you worked with him together, and what you're thinking about the exhibition design was?
Just maybe as an introduction to the thought of the exhibition design, I might explain a little bit like my distance and my relationship with China. I left China in the early 90s, basically my preteen years, and wandered around the world and came to America in my 20s. So that middle, space is kind of floating around. And so when I first met Li Xiangning, I think in 2010, I don't think you thought I was Chinese because my Chinese was so bad. So I've always had this very ambiguous relationship with China, not feeling completely Chinese because I did not witness the innovation and the age of transformation in the 90s firsthand. I think this actually gives me the perfect position to design, I think, in a way, this exhibition to take a stance that's not so much. It was very clear for us from the beginning that I didn't want to put the exhibition on the wall. When you look at some things on the wall two-dimensionally, you're taking that very cautious distance already and looking at it objectively. I wanted to create a space that you can feel and walk in, and you are drawn into the space and you can walk in between the production. And when I first talked about it with Li Xiangling in Shanghai, he said, there are 60 projects on my list, but we're not sure if we're going to show everything. And I got very excited about it. Like, we have 60 models, and let's get the materials and bricks and beams, everything, kind of the messiness and the production, the material here. And we started to work in the office, and the concept of creating this kind of floating object with reflective cladded mirror on these columns that sometimes is reflective, sometimes is transparent, to to establish that relationship that I was talking about. It was very important for us as a starting point for the exhibition. And I remember there was a phone conference between me and Xiangning trying to find wireless connection in Shanghai, and me on the train, very loud train, a cellar train, and then trying to patch everyone in together on the phone. And that was the critical moment. Xiangning was saying that, is it really possible to get to 60 models and all those things on the wall in 3 weeks? And then I was saying, yeah, let's do it. And I said, okay, let's do it. I think
She knows China better than me.
I think if there's anything, we run a pragmatic office in New York as well. So we're always fighting against all this time, the reality of the market, and all these things, maybe to a lesser degree. So I have a huge respect to my contemporary architects in China dealing with what we're dealing with, but 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times more complex politically. So I know that if anyone can pull this together, it's the 60 architects.
There's a hidden story that I was joking with Jupe that today, that the oldest architect in this show is Yonghu Zhang, who's turning 60 this year. So it's a 60 under 60. It's a kind of, it's a kind of
gift, right?
a gift to him, yeah.
For Chinese.
So I'm gonna mix it up in a minute, but first I want to get Jupe's voice. And Jupe, I think you have some slides too. So
I was
Matt,
told to use my work in the show.
Yeah.
Maybe I just very quickly.
Yeah, no, but along the way, if you could, or after, you have an extraordinary practice. Even in China, your practice is extraordinary. We're in a country of extraordinary practices, let's say. Along the way, could you reflect a little bit on why this exhibition is important for someone in your position, and how you feel that how is the exhibition going to maybe expose, extend, deconceal some things about China architecture, even for someone whose practice is like yours?
Maybe I can start from my work.
Yeah.
Since I'm an architect. So I feel very honored to have a chance to make a very short presentation about my work. I was told to use like the 5 to 10 minutes to quick finish my work in this show. The Museum of Imperial Cube in Jingdezhen. How I can control this, I don't know. Which one? Okay. This museum located in the center of the city of the historical area, adjacent to the relic site of Imperial Cube. In Ming and Qing dynasty, Jingdezhen is one of the most important porcelain capital in the world. A lot of porcelain was shipped into the Europe through the ocean Silk Road. The overall city and the people's lifestyle actually based on the porcelain production. The urban structure also formed by the porcelain, the complex consists of like a kiln, workshop, and resident. This is our side. Look at the right side, adjacent to the Imperial Kiln. Actually, a lot of private kilns surrounding this area. This is the side we have to facing unpredictable things happen every day almost. Right after construction start, we found out Ming Dynasty, the housing, the foundation we have to change or design. Really struggling about that. I was deeply inspired by the local historical kiln. And not only this, the perfect handmade, the brick art, but also its sensibility about scale, material, and overall volume. all this character actually associates the experience of the porcelain, the making through the craftsman artistic approach. Look at this, when they reconstruct the traditional kiln, actually no star folding. Everything by hand is make perfectly like a handmade the craft. Like they are making, the whole experience like the craftsman making the porcelain. This typology, primitive typology, not only definitely for the porcelain, also we can find out similar typology in the northwest part of China, like a cave. Our idea actually starts from the lot of conceptual model try to integrate the kiln typology with like a porcelain or soil together. Most of the kiln in Jingdezhen half sunken into the earth in order to achieve the temporary control and also maybe for the humidity, etc. So the museum is use multi-kiln to form the overall the form instead of one block in order to achieve the similar scale with surrounding the historical building. Also can maximize the flexibility to adopt into the very complicated side. The right side is relic imperial kiln. Through the image, probably you can see our studio based on the handmade model, right? It's not a digital approach. We not trust too much trust digital things. We carefully study the scale, and especially we very respect the full the local the kiln. Actually, this size carefully, reference for that, things we trust the experience. This is the overall vault, actually come from all the way down to the B1 level. Ground level cross through the main, those kiln, the historical relic site in between, and then bring people down. So this is a horizontal, a lot open the arch and the vault, create to reflecting the local climate, which is very hot. Most of the volume is sunken into the earth, showing the modest approach. This is the model. Actually, this is based on the Jing Liu's requirement. We have to redo that again. Actually, our model really huge, like a really huge model. This is our final, the close to the final right now. We work on the DD, but construction will start early October. This cross section showing the lecture hall, sunken courtyard, the view from the relic site. We try to combine those two together. The interior study, we want to achieve the more spiritual the space rather than very practical or commercial idea. Things based on the real kiln, the material, everything to give people like familiar, experience, but we also create a lot of flow space to give unfamiliar space. This like and I like is typical, the Chinese aesthetic. From one space into another one through the horizontal, but most of the space we create very, different scale in terms of the program. Some space kind of linear or long, dark. Some space is short and light. The precise floor, and also glass, the handrail to make a perfect contract with this rough the brick work. Between the two kilns, we always take advantage from those space to create some circulation, actual circulation behind this. The general material we minimize to try to make very simple, straightforward concrete brick wood. Even this detail of the wood, we reference Chinese typical things. This is one of the stair between the kiln, the transition. This is the lobby. We can see the double space. Also can see beyond that one. Maybe sometime you can see the open space, which is the relic existing, the relic side. So, and then you can, experience some open space, more small courtyard, also surrounding by the open, this space kind of semi-outdoor and indoor people can protect the sun and also create some shadow. So this organic, the vertical cut try to dialogue with historical pavilion. This is the front of a lecture hall. The horizontal focus on the horizontal relic side, since this is where everything underneath. This is very pure, straightforward lecture hall, just a single kiln to content like 200 seats. Even the lighting, we carefully study how we hide most of the technical things like sprinkler and the lighting things. Also, this idea inspired by the local porcelain, one kind of a porcelain. They made an interesting translucent the material to combine with the product. So this is once again is a kind of an open, not open space to reflecting the local climate. So this is my sketch to discovery about the structure and the system. The first layer we're going to start folding to break the arch, and then the brick arch became to the start folding from the another layer, which is concrete. This concrete structure mainly against the earthquake. This is a code we cannot to. Actually, arch can be perfectly to resolve the overhand, but earthquake code we have to dealing with the concrete, and then the last layer can be enclosed open system, including the air condition. We create a mezzanine mechanical level. This is one of the sunken courtyard represent local Chinese garden character and their typical the climate, the situation. Like Michael said, actually before we started this the panel, the lot of the Chinese architects, especially after maybe 20 or 30 years practice, right now a lot of architects start to rethinking what is critical, what is experimental for them. I believe the nature became to the one of the important things, people to rethink about very low tide, but reflecting the region. Also, the contemporary solution must be rooted into the very Pacific, the history and the culture. This is mainly what I try, the main point what I try to make. Thank you, everyone.
So I want to sort of open it up to a conversation, but the thing I'm trying, I don't quite know how to frame this, but I'm thinking of my own experience as an educator and how much we are learning from Chinese students who are coming into the GSD, taking our lecture courses as well as the studio courses. I'm actually thinking about even the history courses. China, since the 80s at least, has participated fully in the sort of global history of architecture. The first thing I was thinking, Florian and I were talking, that I think a lot of people in the States, they think of, because of the hegemony of the States in Europe in terms of modernism, they think of China as a kind of a kind of a pop in the 80s and 90s that we even use the word alternative modernism. But then if you back away just a little bit, you realize that Spain around the same time, the Netherlands a little bit later around the same time, there were a lot of pops. The regional, the Netherlands because of the subsidies for young architects, Spain because of the death of Franco. So another way of seeing it is not East-West at all, it's just a global modernism and constellations of the modern rather than this divide. So that's one thing I'd like for you to respond to, and maybe even some of the other architects. The other thing, however, in a way against that, there's also, I think at least it's my perception, in seeing your work, Jupe, and realizing because of the size and the population of China, there's no real logical reason for you to care about to care about so much a kind of outside. I mean, China is so big, it kind of constitutes its own planet in some ways. And then, and I'm being a little rude, I know, to explain it that way, but I'll be rude from the other side too. The danger from our side is that to look at a show like this, to see the Chinese constellation of the new modern, the fear I have is that Americans will see it kind of like we do Chinese food, that is something you eat on Sunday night for the kind of flavor, the kind of spicy flavor, and that we won't ever really attempt to come to terms with either its commonalities or its differences. You see what I'm trying to say? So I think it's up to, I think, not so much even to the practicing architects, it's people like the academics and critics to begin to try to understand and position those constellations in a kind of theoretical frame. And I think the exhibition, that's what I would say the exhibition, its importance is to start to bring exposure and reflection on what might otherwise be treated in a very glib way, very, what's the word, more than just glib, yeah, just a kind of offhand way. Or to assume it's the same, but it's not the same, or to assume it's different, but it's not different. Xiangning.
Okay. I think, yes, I agree that, of course, China is not kind of a monkey king out of the stone, but he's a part of the world, and it's also has very close connection with the world. But at the same time, you see also there's a kind of a difference with the path that China was following with, if we compare with Spain or Netherlands. I think the problem is that the older generation, like the founders of the so-called modern architecture education in China, like the professors like Liang Sichen and Tong Jun, that generation, basically most of them are following a kind of, they were taught modern architecture, but basically they are kind of traditional, even the Beaux-Arts kind of system. So China was never in architecture modern. So we have been dominated by kind of also a Russian formalist system for many years until 1980. We just about to open to the real modern. Then then we see postmodern deconstruction rushing in. So it's kind of totally ruined. So basically, so now when we are talking about modern, that the younger generation, after they are educated here and they come back, they like people like Dong Gong and Zhang Ke and Jupe, they are now rethinking or rediscovering a new kind of modern. That's why in China, now you still see such a huge interesting research about Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn these days as a new wave of kind of so that's a thing. And also it's the difference, the gap between the I will use the term individual or independent architects, and the mainstream state-owned institute is so huge that you know that most of the architects shown here, they are not members of a Society of Architects of China. Wang Zhu was not even registered architect. Officially, he's illegal to practice. And when Wang Zhu won Pritzker Prize, the minister, of construction of China was, what the heck? Who is this guy? They don't even know him. So that's, the gap was so huge. So I think the national awards of the architecture never given to those independent architects. They are mainly given only to the state-owned architecture institute. That's, I think, a very unique. It's also the constructing kind of a reality that I always use the word critical or resistance to also the mainstream architecture state-owned system. That's another way to see that they are different from those systems. You have to be critical. That's another situation.
Yeah. I also would like to respond to this question. If I summarize the maybe last 30 years, from the 80 to the, around Olympic time. The Chinese architecture industry is special interesting focus on the one is technology. The second one is futurism, the approach. And also very generic things, everything without really thinking. Just quick, very efficient to brought in from the rest of the country. But I think recently, I believe this is a turning point. I can make some assumption for the future. From the, I believe a lot of architects start to rethink about that thing from the technology into the nature, idea. From the futurism, go to the more primitive or looking back, things, especially in China, a lot of civilization history, they more trust. We start to rediscover the fundamental things from the primitive, architecture. And also from the very international or generic, modernism, things into the more Pacific. It's more related to the region and the local climate. I think this is a kind of a new trend for the Chinese, maybe next 10 or 20 years, to rediscover a lot of things more based on the very Pacific culture, region, climate, etc.
Yes. Antoine?
I was wondering, your question. I think we need probably to get rid of, the neo-stylistic, for example. If we were ready to integrate this architecture, the question is no longer whether it's a kind of critical regionalist or whatever. I think this is no longer the case. I think then what becomes interesting from an historian is point of view for me are questions like the relation to materials, the relation to light. How do you reinterpret form from the past without being historicist? That it raised for me another difficult question, which is, everybody who teaches history today wonders how do we integrate non-Western architecture next to the Renaissance and the traditional canon in architecture school, and perhaps this also provides an entry, that's to say, going backwards. Because, and then rediscovering these other architecture as constituent of what is today's what are today's problems. But I was really struck. It was interesting what you just said about the primitive, because I was struck by the recurrence of this theme in a number of projects. How the question of the primitive is actually a very present question in many of these projects. And that's probably something I have to think about, because this is not so usual to see so many projects revolving around that.
Yeah, I agree with Antoine, because he said that he noticed that in those projects, material is a very important issue. I think some architects even provide a big piece of material that from element from their building, like a Zhang Ke in his micro huton. He invented the kind of a concrete, but he put Chinese ink into the concrete to make a kind of black concrete. He sent here a huge piece of black concrete, but it's too heavy to hang from the ceiling. So it's a pity that you don't see it. And now Yonghu Zhang sent a huge piece of bricks. I think this shows that some of the also the design initiatives was generated. Originated from the concept of material. Like at the very beginning, he's thinking of a brick or porcelain as the material. It's the starting point of architectural design as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to open it very, very soon to the audience, but just one more thing I wanted to mention. If Xiangning, if you're going to stick with this pragmatist label. Iñaki, remind me, it was in 2000 that Museum of Modern Art with Joan Ochman made this pragmatist conference, and you have to imagine this, that Richard Rorty was representing theory of pragmatism, and Peter Eisenman representing architecture. Remember that, Iñaki? Iñaki was a very important member there. But what came from that version of pragmatism? Antoine noticed the kind of, let's say, methodological eclecticism, and I think that's right. That's still there. Even the different materials, different techniques, modern combined with more traditional materials. But remember, Rorty insisted that a pragmatist architecture would be purely result-oriented and would be valued by its novelty. And I don't think the result-oriented, I don't see in many, meaning a much more kind of instrumentalist, not that it doesn't have results, but that it's driven by a kind of functionalist performance coupled with novelty. That I don't see in this version of pragmatism, and one would have to begin to kind of situate the theory itself. And then the other thing was that history didn't matter for Rorty except as a accumulation of thresholds or breakthroughs, right? Accumulation of novel breakthroughs based on audience response almost. So these things are not. It's interesting to compare the pragmatist label, because I think it gets more at the specificity of your version of pragmatist.
I think the word, of course, the word pragmatism was not created by architects. It's I think the father of this word is Dewey. Mm-hmm. And he was invited to lecture in China for.
Dewey was.
Yeah, yes, he was. And there's also a book published. So his lecture in Beijing, Beida University. And I think that's why people always saying that he's very influential among Chinese philosophers and thinkers. So the pragmatism, of course, is also a methodology, also a way of seeing the world. I think it's also the word critical pragmatism is not only used by architects, it's used by philosophers, contemporary people. They're talking about, they're using this word. And also, I think Ole Bormann used this to refer to the Dutch contemporary practice
That's
once,
right.
And the guru of critical pragmatism, as to him, is Rem Koolhaas. And
yeah.
I think so. I'm not the first one to use this, but I think in China, the pragmatism is another way of another version of a kind of a pragmatism, because there are much more aspect that you have to be practical. You have to work with politicians a lot, and you have to work very fast. All those limits that you have to be very pragmatic in order to make your building built. Like even the speed and kind of a low budget is even some limit that even Rem Koolhaas cannot bear. I think this is something that I think it's another kind of condition of extreme in China. So that's why I think maybe it's also a way to use this word to refer to the contemporary condition in China.
Yeah, interesting. Antoine?
Yeah, I think also probably, pragmatism in the sense that there is no transcendental overarching view on the production. And I think this is also what strikes me and what is shown, that, there is the refusal of any point of view that would be unnecessary.
Yeah. Jing, you have a very particular, let's say, position in all this, being, as you said, being Chinese and American together at the same time somehow.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I just want to throw into the conversation another kind of aspect, maybe about the resistance. Li Xiangning mentioned the different forms of resistance. And I think as a practitioner, and maybe can be categorized as critical pragmatist, practitioner. There's another form of resistance. I see it through my own education, through the kind of Japanese movement. Recently, we also did some survey of Iñaki's work, post-Franco, kind of the Spanish movement. And I think there is also a form of resistance towards this generalization, this kind of urge to understand the Chineseness and understand the Japaneseness. What kind of surface always to kind of come up to the surface often are the best survivors, in a way, the people who are the most pragmatic and able to navigate through this complex and often quite disruptive and times. But it's like the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. There's also a huge amount of unspoken, maybe not so kind of obvious forces that's often at work in these times that you mentioned, right? The Dutch and the Spanish and the Japanese and the movement. And what we see today, I mean, the post kind of bubble Japan, you see some of these voices that weren't heard during the 90s started to be more influential and give more force to the Japanese architecture moving forward. What I see in China is, exactly one of the other intention of really wanting to include the 60 projects is to kind of, before jumping into this generalization, where like the urge to understand what is the Chinese condition, what is the Chinese movement, what is the Chineseness, to also kind of just take it as it is. And I think there's a collapse of the time also that's happening at this moment that's much more horizontal and much more dense. That's quite interesting. That's happening. That happens also across different scales.
I want to open up to the audience. Can I just say one more thing, only because I just learned it, that it seems that in 85-ish, there began something that the article I read called Cultural Fever.
Yes. Yeah.
Win Hao Rei?
It's called the 85 the wave movement in contemporary art. Like Iowa belongs to that group of.
Yeah, and also during this time was translated into Chinese. Walter Benjamin, Theodore Adorno, Jacques Lacan, and I'm convinced now, of course, that this resistance and refusal could even have common roots in Frankfurt School theory as the American version. I mean, it amazes me that Jing uses the word resistance, and you said refusal. But it's not implausible totally that the roots are similar, no?
Yeah, I think in the schools there are a lot of reading of those books and the Frankfurt School as well, and also what Benjamin. So I think when people like Wang Shu, when he was doing his PhD, I was doing my master. We studied with the same professor, so we had a lot of discussion, and we went to take philosophy courses and also discuss a lot about this. I do think there's an impact from that kind of a thinking into contemporary Chinese architects. Yeah, that's why Wang Shu is always talking about the kind of resistance in his works.
Yeah. So I want to turn it to the audience and say, for those of you who are getting ready to leave, don't leave yet because there's a reception outside afterwards. Just give us a few more minutes. Question, comments from the audience? Yes, way back in the back.
Hello. I have two questions. First is, as Professor Li has mentioned, Chinese architects has been studying abroad since Liang Sicheng, around that generation, since 100 years ago. But until now, there is still a prevailing trend for architecture graduates from China to go study abroad. Do you have any comments on this kind of phenomenon? Not necessarily good or bad, but this kind of relationship, close relationship or reliance on Western architecture, what is this impact on Chinese architecture? And second question is, with the rise of individual practice, like sporadic star architects rising in China, what is this influence on state-owned companies? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this phenomenon, and also we see that we try to distinguish the different impact from the education in the States and from Europe. So if you calculate the numbers of architects who studied in the States, I think it's I don't know the exact number. I didn't calculate, but I have the feeling that 80% of them are educated here and 20% in Europe. This is the reason that first of all, I think the U.S. schools are the most difficult to get in, so maybe the best students came here, and but also another reason might be that in Europe, that these days people don't have the kind of ambition that they want to enjoy their life. I think they don't want to make a bigger company, like many American people are trying to do. So I do think this has some kind of impact on the way of the thinking of your practice and the kind of career that you are taking. That's why we see here a larger number of portion of this show is from the architects who graduated from here. I think of course we have several architects. Zhu Xiaofeng is a GSD graduate, and Wang Zhenfei, he's at Berlach, but he's now part of Delft, and also Wang Yan graduated from ETH Zurich. Louis Chen graduated from Yale. Okay. So and you, Florida.
Berkeley.
Berkeley. Sorry.
Far away. Too far away.
Berkeley.
Not even
so
close.
You can tell the kind of I have to say that the influence from the early international architectural education background is very important to them, and also these days more and more Chinese students are coming, and we're going to see a next wave of even more active role in the contemporary architecture scene. So.
One more question. Luo.
Thank you very much for the speeches. Critical pragmatism reminds me of something that's actually also very well talked here in the West, I guess. That is the two-faced character of an architect, being pragmatic in order to maneuver through the realistic aspects of the practice in order to get the project done, and also being critical towards like an inner circle of academic architects. So I'm interested to know what is your idea about this sort of like unifying term in its relationship to its audience. Thanks.
I feel I share some common thing with Mosen, that she used the term grounded visionary, right? Something. it's like a kind of a tricky relation between two words then being mixed together.
Yeah.
I think it's try to balance those two extremes and try to find a middle point and position, and not too pragmatic, but also even if you're only critical, you cannot build anything. So you have to find a middle point somewhere. That's why I use the term to be mixed together.
Okay, here. I see. We'll have a few more. Yes. Here. Tiran.
First, I want to thank you for the amazing lecture. So my question is that, as a lot of people have noticed, a lot of the project that you show that they use like traditional material, and the material become like a major theme of their project. So I have my explanation of that, why they use those material. I think because architecture is kind of a practical art, so we are kind of like the last of the production chain of this. So first they are material, so they are like chemistry, science, and then they are manufacture and also construction. So what I think the problem in China is like the manufacture and the construction of the quality of those two things are actually very poor. So the reason why those amazing projects are using traditional material and also their scale are relatively small, I think that one critical reason is because that's why they can control the manufacture and construction of that, so that they can control the quality of the project. But I think there are a lot of like, there are going to be lots of large projects that are being built in China. So that's what I'm worried about, is that as an architect, it's really hard for you to control all those part of the chain. So do you agree with me, like why this is the reason for the traditional material? And what do you think that as an architect we should face the kind of fact, this kind of difficulty in China?
Maybe Jupe and Jing can.
Yeah. So I kind of disagree about the point you made. I believe the architecture must have the motion to dialogue with the people. If you use a lot of material, people doesn't have the motion, or in other way, they never saw this material before, and then they start to leave the distance, hard to communicate. I feel like during my talk I mentioned, you have to somehow to create some new experience, which is people never, explore before. But you have to find out some the familiar, the people knowing this. For example, maybe the material can be represent the media to communicate to people. If you know him, and then you feel intimate. But new experience to attract you, explore. I think this is one of the key for the architecture can be dialogue with the people.
Yep.
So I think what you say is kind of like a subjective reason for architect to like choose those material like on purpose. But what I was trying to say was like there's an objective reason behind this. It's because there are lots of like manufacture and construction quality that you can control. So when you are choosing traditional material, that you can get a chance to work with the local worker. So you will learn a lot from them, and you can control the quality of that. So I think what we said kind of all contribute to the result that we use traditional material. Like what you're saying is like a subjective reason, and mine's like an
maybe
objective
one more respond your last question. Maybe I feel the architecture is very specific to to the Pacific region, especially the certain material. The reason they use this material, they must be very either practical or they have some reason. For example, the traditional material, they go through the 1,000 years. They pretty much prove by the experience, the past experience, especially for the this specific the place. And then you use this, must be very easy and make sense, rather than you create a lot of things. It doesn't fit this climate or region.
Let's have this one question down here, Tiran, and then I think this will be did I see one more behind? No. So this will be the last question.
Lucky.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your talks and your responses. So I guess this is a question for Professor Antoine Picon, because you mentioned the word
specialist of China, as we all know. Okay, I'll do my best.
Or maybe for Professor Li Xiangning, because you mentioned speed. You mentioned speed for several times, and it seems to me that you're implying a kind of criticality towards production or state capitalism in some way. But what I find interesting in the exhibition is that it's really simply, or in some ways, because of this kind of speeding up of urban planning, of urban regeneration in the last 10 years, that we have those bunch of people, like 60 or even more, because I believe Professor Li Xiangning made quite difficult choices in terms of who comes and who's not showing up. So basically, I think this is kind of a dialectic between speeding up and slowing down, because even from reasons like in the last 2 years or 3 years, those urban architects are coming, are spreading to the rural area. So my question is like, so based on this kind of germinating or some booming or explosion happening in the past 10 years, you're kind of implying a slowing down. So are you kind of touching upon a possibility of slowing down by speeding up, or is there?
Well, you've taken a lot of Michael Hayes classes. To Okay, let's put it in simple ways, you know. I think one of the complexity of architecture is that there is a meditative part. Whatever one said, you know, Renaissance humanists said that architecture was a reasoned meditation of use. So you need to meditate. And at the same time, we all know that things speed up. And it was already a question for the moderns, actually. How do we recreate spaces of meditation, you know, within a more and more speeding up world? So I think the way I read this exhibition is, of course, things are going very quickly. And, you know, I suppose in China, like pretty much everywhere in the world, even in slow, lazy Europe, there is the need to keep pace, and at the same time, I think there is the need to recreate, you know, some meditative stance in order to make, and that's what I meant. So it may be a dialectic relation, to use one of my colleagues' favorite buzzword, but I do think there is in architecture a kind of temporal tension. And the way I read these projects is, of course, they have to go very quickly, but at the same time, you have to find ways somewhere to slow down. I think it was a question for the modern. I think it's a question today. It was a question for 19th century America, for example. You know, before the Chinese boom, you know, the first thing that surprised a lot of people in the 19th century was the speed of urbanization in the US. And for people like Sullivan and later, etc., you know, how to go a bit slower when you design was a major question. In Chicago in the 1890s, it was already a question. So all the more in Shanghai, Hangzhou, or Beijing.
I want to thank once again the participants, especially Xiangning Li for the curation and Jing Liu for the wonderful exhibition design. Also, of course, all the architects, and thank you so much also you who came and participated with us. It was really great to have you here, Jupe. And the students, I mean, I have to say, I feel a buzz here. I'm really glad this happened at the JSD, and I want to sort of relish that the fact that it's here, because I think it's very exciting, and hope it will lead to many other things. Thank you all for coming. There's a reception outside.